things that shaped women's lives in the ancient world. And in particular, we've talked about the way that women owned property and acted as patrons, and various things that we can do. So even once people know that, there's often still a residual question that people want to ask me, which is, well, they still couldn't speak, right? They still couldn't be leaders because our expectation is that women were silent in the ancient world. And there are reasons that we have that expectation, but I want to argue again today that we're wrong about that expectation, and to paint a somewhat different set of expectations around speech and silence for women with you today. And at the very end, I'm going to ask you to interpret some New Testament passages based on what we talk about. So again, feel free to jump in with any questions that you have, because they're probably questions other people have as well. All right, so let's see. There we go. I want to start by the impressions that we have about why silence is something we think was expected of women. There are statements that suggest that this was a conventional idea that women should be silent. So one story that is told by the Roman historian Livy is of a period of time. This is prior, he's writing in the New Testament period, but he's writing about a period in the olden days when there were laws that had been imposed during a time of war that restricted the ways that people could display their wealth, especially the kinds of clothes that they could wear and whether or not they could ride in a carriage around Rome. And this was meant to divert the funds towards the war efforts. But after the war had passed, people wanted, their freedom back. And so there were two senators who proposed that they repeal these laws. And women turned out, as well as men, advocating for the repeal of these laws. They wanted them repealed. So they're out in the streets, talking to senators on their way to the forum, trying to get the laws changed. And here's what Livy says, one of the people speaking against the repeal of these laws, right, in favor of the old way of doing things, he says this in part. He says, sorry. No, wait, that's not right. There we go. What sort of practice is this of running out into the streets and blocking the roads and speaking to other women's husbands? Could you not have made the same requests, each of your own husband at home? Or are you more attractive outside and to other women's husbands than your own? And yet, not even at home, if modesty would keep matrons within the limits of their proper rights, did it become you to concern yourselves with the question of what laws should be adopted in this place or repealed? So based on this, it sounds a lot like there are cultural norms about women's silence that Cato is drawing on to suggest that women shouldn't actually be advocating about this law, right? And the idea that women should be at home, speak to their husbands, rather than be out in the streets speaking to other people is conveyed in this speech. And in fact, so this suggests that there are these social norms out there, right? We also might hear a sort of echo of some New Testament text in this passage, because in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul writes this: as in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there's anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. So you get some of the same ideas there, right? That this is conventional, that women are silent, that they can talk to their husbands at home. And based on evidence like that, just a couple of sayings like that in the ancient world, we've constructed this idea that women just weren't able to speak, especially outside the home, and were completely silent. But there are a number of problems with that view. One of them is that when you take Cato's speech in context, what he says is actually much more complicated than simply women shouldn't speak. He doesn't actually say those words to the women in the streets. He doesn't tell them to go home and speak to their husbands. He's quoting himself as if he should have said that to the women. But what he's doing is he's speaking to the senators in the forum, and he's crafting a speech to say why they should support his side. Let me give you a little more context. What he says at first is, had not respect for the dignity and modesty of some individuals among the women, rather than of the sex as a whole, kept me silent, lest they should seem to have been rebuked by a consul. I should have said to them, what sort of practice is this running out into the streets? So a couple of important things to notice here. One is that Cato stops himself from speaking to the women in the streets because of the modesty and dignity of some of the matrons among them. He does not quote to them a blanket rule, hey, you can't talk in the street, go home, because that's not really true. It doesn't really function that way. But there are some social norms about women's silence that he can draw on in the forum to suggest to the men that, gosh, the women are running crazy, doing things that women aren't supposed to do. And you need to uphold these laws in order to keep that sort of thing from happening. So there's something going on there, but it's not as straightforward as we have suggested that it would be. If the idea that women, speaking or breaking the rules had happened, we would not have expected them to be successful in their appeals regarding this law that Cato's speech is about. But in fact, as the story goes on, Livy tells us that even more women came out the next day to argue about the repeal of these laws, and they were successful. They convinced the senators and the leaders that the laws should be repealed. So there's more going on than just meets the eye if we take a single quote out of its context. So in order to flesh out the social rules of speech and silence, I want to look at some other evidence for speech. Clearly, we need more than just one or two quotes. There is considerable evidence that women's speech was a normal part of everyday life. Women prayed and prophesied. They advocated for their everyday needs, and they completed the jobs that they needed to do. And speech was an important part of all of that. So based on what we've already talked about, you probably aren't going to be surprised about some of this, right? The way that we've seen women acting as patrons, for example, the kinds of occupations that I've talked briefly about women having, all of those would require speech in some way, right? The very first day we saw a woman, Junia Rustica, who was a priestess, right? There are jobs that women have that require them speaking clearly. And so it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise to you now that that's in fact the case, and women are actually taking up speech in their everyday lives. So I want to look at prayer, and we'll briefly mention prophecy, and then talk about everyday norms of advocacy and speech. Here's one example of prayer. This is from the book of Judith, which is one of the apocryphal books of the Bible, the ones that are in between the New Testament and Old Testament, if you have an NRSV study Bible. This is Judith praying. She says, "But your strength, gods, does not depend on numbers, nor your might on the powerful, but you are the God of the lowly, helper of the oppressed, upholder of the weak, protector of the forsaken, savior of those without hope. Please, please, God of my father, God of the heritage of Israel, Lord of heaven and earth, creator of the waters, king of all your creation, hear my prayer." So I don't know if you know the story of Judith, but Judith's town is under military threat, and she intervenes and saves the town. This is her prayer as she sets out to do that. And Judith is actually praying in her home at this point, but she's also praying, the text tells us, at the time that offerings are being made in Jerusalem, in the temple. And so she's sort of aligning her prayers in a way as a kind of intercession for her town. And that is in fact the role that she takes on. Her prayers are also deeply political in nature, right? It's about the military salvation of her town. And so we need to read Judith's prayers in that light as well. And she is in fact successful at saving her town from destruction. This kind of prayer and just everyday prayers were really conventional in the ancient world. Here's an example from a story about a woman, Anthea. It says, "On behalf of her husband, Habercomes, Anthea dedicated her hair to the god." This is an inscription that's found in a temple, and ancient temples were filled with writing, sometimes on pieces of paper, sometimes inscribed onto the walls, either written or chiseled. People came there and they not only made petitions to the gods, but they left a record of them in many instances. And so we have some evidence, although this one is from a story, we have also inscriptional evidence of women and men coming and praying their devotion to the gods. So this is just very common, conventional sort of prayer. And it's spoken out loud, as well as being written down, at least sometimes written down. So other evidence shows us that women were prophets. This was also a conventional kind of speech, that women acted as oracles or as prophets in the ancient world. Both Jewish women prophets, Greek and Roman, from all different cultures, we have this pattern of people. Some were very famous, like the oracles at the shrine of Apollo at Delphi. Another very famous, really maybe the most famous set of prophetic oracles of the time were the Sibling Oracles, which were a written set of prophecies that were very important. In Rome, there was a set of them that were often consulted by the leaders before they took important actions, for example. And these were sort of collections over the centuries from female prophets called the Sibyls. Women also spoke on a more human level as advocates for others and as advocates for their own needs. And I want to give you some examples of these various kinds of speech. Consider this carving from a marketplace in Ostia, which is Rome's port city. A female proprietor is depicted there in the middle, selling her wares. We should assume that, like other who bought or sold products at the market, she had to speak as she communicated about what she had for sale, and she negotiated with buyers and sellers. Nothing in the image suggests that this activity is frowned upon or unusual in any way. And in fact, it seems not to have been. We have other inscriptions, for example, that honor a deceased spouse who was, a fruit seller at the city steps or something like that, right? So the idea that women have these roles as proprietors seems fairly common and well established. In addition to business interests, though, women also spoke to advocate for political and social needs of those around them. You might remember that we talked about inscriptions from Junia Theodora, who was a woman in Corinth at the time of Paul, and she was praised for helping her people in a time of political need, right? So the idea that women would speak on behalf of their people, advocate, and use their authority is important. I want to give you another example from a story told from a woman named Hylen, whose father was king, but her husband actually attacked her father's side of to take over their city. And so she was sort of caught in the middle. The father's side eventually prevailed, and her husband fled to a temple to sort of plea for his life. And so everybody gathers there, Hylen, the husband, and the father, the king, all in this temple. And it's Hylen who is the one who's asserting her voice and saying what she thinks should happen. And here's a portion of her speech. She says, "Ever since your sorrows and your exile," she's talking to her father, "grief has been my steadfast mate and companion. Must I then, now that you are king in Sparta and victorious over your enemies, continue to live in this sad state of grief, or put on the splendid attire of royalty after seeing the husband of my youth slain at your hands?" So she draws attention to the fact that she's the one caught in the middle. She was sorrowful when her father was exiled, and now she'll continue to be sorrowful if he kills her husband. And in the end, she makes a persuasive speech, not simply because of the emotional impact of it, but because she argues that killing her husband would destabilize the city further, because it would suggest that her father was a tyrant and not able to resolve things in a easier way. This is part of the end of what she says. Sorry, sometimes it doesn't actually click. She says, argues that royal power is a thing so great and so worth fighting for, that for its sake it is right to slay a son-in-law and ignore a child. So she's telling him that if he kills her husband, this is what people will think about royal power. that it is worth everything, right? And family and everything else goes to the side. So her appeal plays on this ongoing political debate about the importance of upholding freedoms and other values, not just political power, not just authority. And her speech persuades her father, and he sends her husband into exile rather than killing him. There are numerous other examples, certainly not anywhere near as many examples as we have of men making important political speeches, but the fact that women do make speeches like this is notable, and it's not simply a one-off, but there are lots of examples of that. One other example I want to give you is going back to Judith's story, because it might be one that's familiar to some of you. Okay, there we go, just a delay. Here's again part of Judith's story. She sent her maid to summon Uzziah and Chabris and Charmis, the elders of her town. They came to her, and she said to them, "Listen to me, rulers of the people of Bethulia. What you have said to the people today is not right. You have even sworn and pronounced this oath between God and you, promising to surrender the town to our enemies unless the Lord turns and helps us within so many days. Who are you to put God to the test today and to set yourselves up in the place of God in human affairs?" So because of this threat to their town, right, the elders, as Judith says here, have sworn an oath that if God, God needs to help them in so many days or they'll give up, right? And she's calling them out, right? So notice the way that the story is told. She sends her maid to summon the elders to her, right? And they come to her and she just starts dressing them down, right? Telling them that what they have done is not right. Now, in the story, to his credit, Uzziah, who seems to be the spokesperson for the elders, he responds by saying, Judith is right. He acknowledges that what the leaders have done is not correct. And yet they have sworn an oath and he can't go back on his oath. And so they still go forward with their wrong-headed actions. And that's what sets up Judith to be the one who has to save the town from the military actions. But the story is told in such a way that nobody's surprised that Judith does this, right? She's a woman of high standing in her community already, and she's right. So when this happens, they go to her as if that's a normal thing that men would do, to go and listen to a woman speak to them, and then they respond appropriately. All right, so all of that is to say that if we simply are thinking about what are the social rules of speech and silence, if we're starting simply with the idea that women should be silent, we're going down the wrong path. There's too much going on that we will have to account for to simply have that as the rule that we're thinking about. So we want to define the social rules in a way instead that actually includes women's speech as well as silence and helps us understand when speech happens and when it doesn't happen. We want to think about social status because that's clearly going to be part of speech and silence, right? Hylen was an extremely high-standing woman in her city. Her father was king and her husband had been king briefly when that happened. Judith is a high-standing woman in her city too, right? So we want to think about the role of social status, but it's not simply the case that only elite women speak and nobody else does either, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have some of the other women that we have evidence of who are speaking in social situations, or the business woman in the marketplace, that sort of thing. So just giving us a wider set of rules to think about. So the first one is that silence was evidence of appropriate deference to one's social superiors in the New Testament period. Silence was a virtue, in fact, for any person who found him or herself in the presence of those society considered to be of higher status. Consider this following quote from the philosopher Plutarch and understand that he's thinking about a male audience in this case. He writes, it will also be very advantageous for chatterers to frequent invariably the company of their superiors and elders. Out of respect for his opinion, they will become accustomed to silence. So because Roman society was hierarchical, knowing whom one could speak to and what to say at the right time, like all of that was very important, not just for women, but for men as well. And so Plutarch is thinking that men should train themselves. If you're inclined to, rabble off at the mouth all the time, in the wrong circumstances, you should train yourself by spending a lot of time around those who are your elders or superiors, because you'll just have to learn to shut up. And so this is clearly a social value, not just for women, but something that people in the culture in general were thinking about. When is it wise to be silent, and when is it wise to speak? However, sometimes women were socially superior to men. It's always important to keep in mind that it was not the case that all women were inferior to all men. And I think this is one of the major mistakes that we've made when we're reading the ancient world, is having that misconception. Social status, though, was a combination of factors. It included things like whether you were well-born, if you were a citizen of Rome or another important city, if you were wealthy. Gender was a component of it, but it wasn't the only thing. If you were freeborn or enslaved, like all of those factors were part of your social status, but there wasn't one of them that was like an on-off switch, right? Even some enslaved people became very wealthy and had a lot of clout because they were maybe enslaved to a really wealthy, important person, right? So even that sort of status doesn't tell us by itself what a person's ability to speak or to have authority in the community would be. All of the different factors need to be included when we're thinking about it. So gender was one factor, but I would say it was actually relatively less important than many of these others. A wealthy woman was likely to be experienced as a higher status person than many men who were around her. And in such cases, her speech would be welcome. So that helps us to understand why Judith or Hylanus, other women that we've seen, would have, their speech would be welcomed and expected, not something when it happens that somebody stands up and says, hey, you can't do that, you're not supposed to talk, right? But in fact, it just is a normal part of the story, because speech of those women in the moment were expected. Okay, here's another example. This is a fictional account of a writer, and the narrator is encountering his wealthy aunt on the road. He wasn't expecting to. He says, I am embarrassed in front of a woman whom I do not know, I answered, suddenly blushing, and I just stood there looking at the ground. Then she turned and stared at me. He inherited that well-bred behavior, she said, from his pure and virtuous mother, Salvia. So he knows this wealthy aunt because she's a wealthy, important person, but she doesn't really feel like he knows her and can speak to her. So he's silent when they meet because it seems inappropriate for him to approach this woman and speak to her. And she speaks to him first, and she declares that his silence is actually well-bred behavior because he's acknowledging the social differential that exists between the two of them. All right, so the third rule then is that bold speech on behalf of one's city or family was virtuous. When speech is described as virtuous or effective, it is often speech that is made on behalf of others, and especially one's family and one's city. So if you think about the example of Hylanus, she was really in a hard spot, both in terms of her family and her city. Her city was sort of in a moment of civil war, and it was her father versus her husband that were the central figures in the war. She steps up into the middle of that and provides a solution, sort of a way forward, and really a way of framing the situation so that her father can see why it would be virtuous for him not to kill his opponent who seems to have been, ruining the city. You can see how that might have been thought to be a good idea, but she sort of provides both a way to see this as an act that's done for the sake of his family and his city, to just exile the husband rather than to kill him. So Judith also, right? She's the one who sees what's necessary to save her city, and sees that the male leaders have done what's wrong and really have set up the situation where they are so that they're in dire straits. And so in situations like this, women who are acting on behalf of their city or family, or people group, are viewed as virtuous and not as doing something inappropriate or wrong. All right, what questions do you have about that social context? Anybody? Theodore, you're muted if anybody's trying to speak there, I can't. Okay, I'm just going to go on and talk about speech and silence in the New Testament. So the words on the slide are the same except for the heading, because what I want to say is that these are the same social rules that we should imagine shaping the readers of the New Testament who first understood it. We're conditioned to think that women in the New Testament were completely enjoined to silence. And those assumptions have shaped the way that we have read the New Testament. But if we look again and think about some of the things that are represented in the New Testament as happening, we may notice women speaking more, and we may also have different expectations about the reception that women would get when they speak in the New Testament. So let's look at a couple of examples. And I am going to ask you to unmute at this point and join in. This is participatory. So as I show you a couple of slides of New Testament passages, I want you to just identify what words in the passage relate to the things that I've been talking about, and help us to make those connections out loud. All right, so here's the first one. This is the story from the beginning of Luke of the prophet Anna. There was also a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was of great age, having lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, then as a widow to the age of 84. She never left the temple, but worshiped there with fasting and prayer night and day. At that moment, she came and began to praise God and to speak about the child to all who were looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. So what do you notice in the passage that relates to the topics that we've been talking about?
I wondered if her age gives her authority to speak.
Yeah, absolutely, Deanna, it does. Age is also a factor in social status. And often, this culture was, more like current day Asian culture, I would say, than American culture. Like elderly people are revered and have status because of their age. And so clearly just even the way that it's mentioned here, right, suggests to us that this is an important factor in thinking about who Anna is.
But she's also identified as the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. Does that give her status?
It could, right? We don't know who Phanuel is, but the fact that he's mentioned makes it sound like there might be a reason to say that, right? So that, yeah, saying that she has a lineage that, she comes from one of the tribes of Israel. And perhaps if her father is known, that would give us a sense that she is a person of standing too, right? If she's well born, she's at least, she's at least Jewish woman is part of what that's telling us for sure, right? So it's giving us some sense, but it's hard to say exactly what in terms of her status.
Well, she was praising God, so that kind of hits the bold speech on behalf of someone else, I guess. It was appropriate to praise God.
That's right. Exactly. She's praising God and speaking about the infant Jesus, right? And recognizing something about Jesus and his identity, even at that state, right? Knowing who he is in some way. And so that's why she is speaking prophetically about Jesus. We haven't also said that she's actually called a prophet, right? That's how she's introduced. There was also a prophet, Anna. So she has this role already in the community. It's not just that she's a known woman in the temple who speaks about Jesus, but that this is actually a way that she's identified to the community as a prophet. Anything else? So I guess the one other thing that I want to mention is that she's speaking in the temple as she does this. And just to acknowledge that and state it outright, because we do have this impression, again, a false impression that women didn't speak in public. And if there was speech that women did, that it shouldn't be, in a public space. And so here she is in a very public space, so the public space, if there is such a thing in the ancient world, speaking about, this important event of the Messiah's birth. All right, here's another kind of strange example. This might be something that you haven't even really noticed is in the New Testament before. This is at the in the trial narrative in Matthew's gospel. As Jesus is before Pilate, this happens. While Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." So what are your thoughts about this verse?
I always thought Pilate was on ease, but I didn't pick up that his whole family was on ease about it.
So his family's involved here, not just Pilate. And I think it's interesting. I mean, it wasn't something that I had ever noticed until relatively recently either, this single verse. Anybody else want to describe what's happening here in relationship to anything that we've talked about today? Anything stand out to you?
Did she interrupt him in his place of business?
Oh yeah, can you say that a little louder?
That she's interrupting him in his place of business.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, he's sitting on the judgment seat, which actually in those days, it is his place of business. You're exactly right. But it is also his residence. And this is very common in antiquity, that official public actions actually took place in domestic spaces. So there isn't the kind of separation that we think about between public and private in the ancient world. And that wasn't even a category that would have made sense to them really in a way. So she is interjecting, but it makes more sense, I think, if you understand that there wasn't a kind of sharp line between like the judicial actions that Pilate has and his household, because they're actually in the same place as well. She says that she suffered because of a dream about Jesus, and we should see dreams and their interpretation as being something that's sort of similar to prophecy. That's how ancient people understood it, right? Having a dream and having it interpreted. Dreams were often an interjection from the gods about human life. And so, Pilate and his wife are Roman, right? He's the Roman procurator at the time. So they're not Jewish, right? It's not even necessarily in their mind Yahweh who would be sending this dream, but but she's right? The dream actually, she calls him an innocent man, and wants Pilate not to have anything to do with him. So that's really interesting, kind of strange information that shows up in our story. And it's the fact that it's Pilate's wife that is interjecting this is also really interesting. Clearly, though, I mean, the other thing to say about the context and where they are is that it's Pilate's wife and her own status and relationship to Pilate that puts her in the position to influence the proceedings, right? If anybody was going to be able to, it would be someone like her who could take on that role, and she tries. And she does seem to have some effect. Pilate tries to wash his hands of the whole affair, but or at least says he tries, but doesn't actually. But there's this question in Matthew about Jesus' innocence that's sort of at the heart of the story in some ways. The fact that an innocent man is killed, and the Pilate's wife plays a role in that because of the way that she frames the story.
But it also makes me think that she recognized that, Pilate had a good thing going. All he had to do was keep the peace. The money was flowing back to Rome. If he just didn't mess it up, they had a really good deal. They were near the coast or whatever, I don't know. But she kind of recognized that, man, if this could go really wrong for you, let's back off and try to get out of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, I think in a lot of ways that was the Roman procurator's job. It was you were sort of really trying to keep the peace as much as anything, right? And so when there were disturbances in the populace, it was a complex role, right? Because you wanted to dispel those problems, but doing so in this case could make either side unhappy, and so it's not a straightforward job, but complex and political. All right, here's one more. This is now from Paul's letter to the Romans. At the very end, he starts talking about people greeting people, and he starts out this way. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever way she may require from you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. So this verse doesn't actually mention speech, but I wonder what expectations it creates for you about the role that Phoebe might have had in Rome when she arrived there, and why.
She's a benefactor, so it sounds like she's wealthy.
That's right. She's the benefactor of many and of Paul as well. So that does raise the expectation that that's what that means, right? Is that she's a patron, she has money and social influence. Thanks. Any other thoughts?
It sounds like they want to roll the red carpet out for her.
Yeah, that's right. Welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you. Yeah, so again, that suggests that that she's a person of prominence, right? That they're expected to welcome.
Who could
Any
be
other?
chosen as a deacon of the church?
Yeah, say the question again.
Who could be chosen as a deacon of the church?
Who could be chosen as a deacon of the church? Such a great question. Nobody knows. So last week we talked about the language in 1 Timothy that talks about choosing deacons according to their criteria, right? And what were the qualifications for those offices. Many people think that 1 Timothy is written a little bit later than Paul's letter to the Romans and not by Paul. But either way, these give us this early sense that there are deacons in the church that have some sort of official capacity, and that they are chosen, and that there are men and women, right? Both here and in 1 Timothy, we get the sense that women are deacons as well. So we don't know, but what we can say is that choosing anybody to fulfill one of these kind of offices that we've seen in inscriptions and other of these sources, like you want someone who is high standing in your community. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're the wealthiest person. They can also be a high standing person because of their piety and devotion or other virtues. But chances are, if you have somebody who's all of those things in your community, that's going to be the person that you want as a leader, right? So people made those same decisions, just like we do when we're thinking about, who should we nominate as a deacon or elder? We look for the people that have the criteria, that are going to be able to do the job in the way that we hope that it will be done. And I think the same is true here. So we don't really know what deacons did, and we don't know how many there were or how they got to have that job. But it does give a sense that Phoebe has a particular role in her own community in Cancri, and that gives her some sort of authority too as she goes to Rome, right? The way that Paul is introducing her here is saying, hey, she's a deacon, right? And that's part of why you should welcome her in a fitting way and help her out. Other observations or questions about this one? All right, we've got 15 minutes left. So what are the other questions about speech and silence that you have about women in the New Testament? How is there a particular way that you'd like me to frame my closing comments? Anything that comes to mind? And I guess partly I'm wondering, like when you read back over the 3 points that are on the screen about the social rules of silence, do you have any objections to those? Or is there a way that you've heard people talk about the Bible that raises questions for you about what I've said?
I wondered if you could go back to the passage from Corinthians. I think we had a few people come in a little after that. If you could remind us or apply, what you've told us now back to that passage.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Let me just go all the way back there. Can't remember exactly where it was. Oh, that wasn't it? There we go. All right. So yeah, how do we think about this kind of language where it's explicitly being said that silence is appropriate, right? And the idea that women are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. In my mind, this fits the social rules that we've been talking about. It is saying, it's sort of restating the general rule that silence is appropriate when you are around those who are socially superior to you. And the idea is that women are socially inferior to their husbands, right? So if your husband is there, your husband should be doing the speaking, not the woman herself. However, we do have instances, even when that's still the case, we do have instances where women are expected to speak. And in 1 Corinthians, we also see evidence that women are speaking in church. In chapter 11, Paul says that is talking about women covering their heads in worship, but and that there is a sign again, there's gender differentiations. Men don't cover their heads, women do cover their heads. But in both cases, the action is that they're praying or prophesying in church. And so women have those roles already. They're not actually silent, they're speaking as well. So within this one letter, 1 Corinthians, we have both of those things happening, right? We have women speaking in church in a way that is not forbidden, right? And is in fact desired, because Paul goes on to say in the intervening sections of the letter that prophecy is like the best thing that you can do next to being an apostle, being a prophet. It's great, you're speaking God's words to the people, the message that God is telling you. And so women as well as men are doing that job. And yet we also have this same ideal that can be mentioned at the same time without noticing the contradiction, right? Because nobody in the letter, like Paul doesn't say, oh yeah, how does this fit with what I said before, right? To them, it just does fit. They understand the social rules that shape all of that speech and make sense of it. But we have this idea that women are subordinate to men according to law or custom, and that in particular with respect to their husbands, women should allow the husband to be the spokesperson for the family.
You also have to think about Paul too, and where he was. He didn't have a lot of time for social norms or the rules here, because tomorrow Christ was coming and all this would go away in the kingdom of God. We wouldn't have these things. He saw a different future, and he thought, he flip-flopped on circumcision. He's like, absolutely, you don't do it. But hey, Timothy, you're going there, it'll help you. Go ahead and do it. So he was whatever fit the moment to get by until Christ came. I don't think he was
a politician.
Yeah, he was kind of trying to make it work. He cut a whole bunch of deals with James about, okay, we won't do this and we won't do that so that we can eat together. He just wanted it to be one church under Christ. He didn't care about governments, social norms, or anything, because he thought when Christ comes, we're just going to be transformed into one spirit, and all these genders and all this stuff doesn't matter. So he's not really one to give good advice to churches in the long haul, because he wasn't thinking of the long haul. He was thinking right now, get by and get forward. I don't know. I'm not a New Testament scholar, but
I think, there's definitely something to what you say, but I do think there are places where Paul upholds a lot of the recognized social norms and virtues of his day. So, for example, we often forget texts like Romans 13, where Paul says that you should defer to the authorities of your day, that they're put there by God to rule over you. And it's a strange thing for Paul to say, right? Because he's always getting in trouble with the authorities. So even there, we see this strange, like both and in what Paul says. But that is a very common ancient idea that, that hierarchy is there for a reason. And people really, it's very different from our own culture. People really believed in hierarchy and did not really question it. And that's part of why these social norms about women or enslaved people and so forth that are in the Bible really get at us and weren't something that people noticed. So there are other virtues too I could talk about that Paul upholds that were commonly recognized. And I think what I would say is that, if you're going to found a new religion today, and you're going to try to convince everybody else in the room there with you to come and join your new religion, you're going to need to do it on the basis of some kind of shared values, right? You can't just say, come join my religion. We think incest is really great, because everybody in the room is going to back away from you very quickly, right? You're going to have to do it on the basis of something that would be appealing to people at the time, right? And Paul is doing that too. He is talking about new things, and he's talking about Christ and this new way that is possible in Christ. But he's appealing to people who speak the language that he speaks, right, and come from the culture that he comes from. And so he's, also communicating to them in that way on the basis of kind of shared values. So I think it's a yes and no. There is a sort of new ideas that Paul is offering for sure, and yet they're not. They're understandable to people of the time based on shared values. And I think when he's talking about women, he's saying kind of exactly the same thing that the culture is saying. On the one hand, there are social norms of silence, and on the other hand, women, of course, they're supposed to speak because we need them to be prophets and we need them to be deacons and all of that kind of thing. Any other questions? All right, well, I want to thank you so much for your interaction. It's been great to be with you all. I guess I should have done this before, and we could have turned on the camera in the theater.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here. This is the third and final week in our special teacher series. But if you're looking for Sunday school next week, we'll be meeting downstairs in the garden room and starting a new theme in the following series, which is confession. If you're interested or if you want a book, I have a bunch up here you can take a look at, or you can grab one. And any other announcements with this? So thanks again for coming. Sorry, God.